those things which time has forgotten. For example, this is modern Egypt today. 90% of the population of Egypt is Muslim. Egyptian culture is part of Islamic civilization. Cairo is called the city of 1,000 minarets. The same is true throughout the Near East and North Africa, from Morocco all the way around to Turkey. It takes a major effort of imagination to understand that this was not always the case. Indeed, it is one of the most striking paradoxes of human history that Egypt, Palestine and Syria were the birthplace of Christianity and the region in which, for centuries, it most vigorously flourished. The Near East, as we now call it, has undergone at least 3 fundamental civilizational reconfigurations. For centuries of prehistory, the coastal strip of Syria, Judea, had been the meeting place and the flashpoint between the 2 great original civilizations, that of Mesopotamia and Persia, and of pharaonic Egypt. In 332 BC, Alexander the Great led his Macedonian army into Egypt, where he was greeted as the son of the Egyptian god Amun-Ra. In 331, he founded the Hellenic city of Alexandria, which became the new capital, and in time the richest and culturally the most splendid city of the Mediterranean. By 80 BC, it was part of what was soon to be the Roman Empire. The story is similar for Syria, where Antioch on the Orontes, was founded in 300 BC. These cities were the 2 metropoles of civilization in the eastern Mediterranean, until the foundation of Constantinople 600 years later. Constantinople, we must remember, was in this sense an upstart and a disturber of an ancient order of precedence and prestige among cities. This is what is nowadays called the Hellenic world, the heir of the rich civilization of classical Greece and Ionia, and from whose cities Rome absorbed its own culture with enthusiasm from the 200s BC onwards, transforming itself into the capital of a politically coherent Romano-Hellenic civilization. So let us focus in on the region of Egypt-Syria, as it was in the 500s and 600s AD. Egypt was the largest in terms of population, the most fertile because of the Nile, and the richest component in the Roman Empire. It was the most ordered in that under the pharaohs it had an immensely long experience of being a unified, ruled society with a single elaborate religious ideology perpetuated by a specialized priesthood. Since the Roman dominion had stabilized under Augustus, no exterior military threat had been felt by Egypt for centuries. The crisis of the later 200s had left it untouched. With its security untroubled, Egypt was, from an imperial perspective, spectacularly productive of the revenues needed by the state. Taxes were collected completely, timely, and in full. Every year, Egypt delivered up 8 million artabas of grain to Constantinople, that is 312 million litres, ensuring the food supply not only for the city, but also for feeding and paying the imperial armies. Justinian had combined its previously twin military and civil governorships into one office, that of the Praefectus Augustulus, who was responsible to Constantinople for the whole diocese of Aegyptus. He had an administrative staff of 600 officiales, exactly the same word and the same meaning as we have today, officials. Etymologically interesting is the office which Diocletian had established, that of the Catholicos, the Catholic, who was the official charged with the supervision of tax collection and its shipment for the whole of the country, thus a universal supervisor. Under the Praefectus Augustulus were the governors of the nomes or provinces. He was called the praeses, each with his own smaller staff of officials. The nomes went from the Mediterranean coast to beyond the first cataract, called the Heptanomia, the Thebaid, and the Dodecaschoenus. There were two levels of officials: the Ministeria Illiterata, illiterate ministers, who were poorly paid, and the Ministeria Literata, the literate ministers, who were better paid and had access to higher sportule, the fees, or we would say bribes, paid by people who needed their services. One of these literata we know of was Flavius Dioscorus, who worked as a nomikos, or lawyer, on the staff of the dux, the duke. He had spent the year 551 to 553 in Constantinople, and was a landowner as his father had been. We also know of Flavius Theodorus, the exceptor in the office of the Dux Augustulus Thebaidis. In his will of 567 AD, he left properties and endowments to piae causae, pious causes, as well as pensions of 6 solidi a year to each of his freed slaves. The papyri records we have show that the practice was to manumit, that is legally free, household slaves by the time they were in their mid-30s to early 40s, a kind of pensioned retirement. Another insight into domestic life comes from a letter by a Christian slave owner grumbling that the household slaves, the otekis, did not hesitate to talk back to their masters. The writer complains to his friend that he has been unable to bear the constant hubris, the outrageous remarks of his oketes agathos. This sounds like a scene from one of Menander's comedies.
This time is to celebrate the festival of the prolific goose. Lay all night. Well, it's all right for them, but it's me who has to clear up all the mess. You should see it.
Slaves could also be a danger to the well-to-do. A document from Hermopolis tells of a court case. The accuser, Philemon, reports that his son had been attacked, beaten to within an inch of his life, and robbed of a substantial sum in public funds that he was carrying, 12 gold solidi, by a party of 4 slaves. Philemon, by his name and social role, was obviously an Egyptian using the Greek language and of Hellenic culture. He was of the type one found all over the Roman Eastern Mediterranean, the middle and upper classes who ran the society, descendants of those who had come after the original Macedonian annexation by Alexander the Great, and who had flourished under the Ptolemaic and Seleucid kings of Egypt and Syria. Those who wanted to make a career in the imperial administration also spoke Latin, which remained the language of the state, of administration, of law, and of the army until the mid-600s. Many of them spoke at least some Demotic, the old language of Egypt, in order to communicate with their slaves, with market stallholders, porters, messengers, etc. Demotic, of the demos, or the people, as in democracy, is the Greek term given to the patois spoken by the poor and illiterate mass of the society from the time of the pharaohs, a form of writing retained by the temple priesthood as a written and sacral script. However, from about 50 AD onwards, it too died out, leaving Greek as the only written language in which Egyptians could express and record their thought. The Hellenic social order was centered on the cities and focused on the gymnasion, a combination of a gym for physical exercise in our sense, from which we get, of course, the word gym, but also for education, socializing, and relaxation. A kind of community club, one could say. Parents registering their children for the socially crucial Greek schooling by the grammatikos, or teacher, wrote long lists of their ancestors to prove their privileged Hellenic descent. Those cities had names which have long since been obliterated, but which have been the scenes of a vigorous, lively, and of a recognizably Western culture for 900 years. Names like Alexandria, Hermopolis, Panopolis, Antinoopolis, Philadelphia, Oxyrhynchus, Pelusium, Ptolemais, Heliopolis, etc. Alexandria stood head and shoulders over all the rest, as the undisputed metropolis and center to which all the other Egyptian cities looked, and which the Mediterranean world saw as its second most splendid jewel. Excavations of an ancient rubbish dump at the deserted city of Oxyrhynchus have uncovered a treasure trove of Greek papyri. They reveal the immense continuity of the Hellenic cultural tradition and how deeply it was implanted in this flourishing city halfway up the Nile. Previously unknown texts of the archaic poets Pindar, Sappho, and Alcaeus from the 400s BC have been found, alongside plays by Euripides and Sophocles, previously lost to us. And then, miraculously, a rich find of texts by the father of Western comedy, Menander, flourished about 300 BC. Our comic theatrical tradition, its conventions, its stock types and attitudes, and indeed its particular spiritual locus, derive from Roman imitations of Menander by Terentius, Plautus, and others. Now we have some of the precious originals. The bulk of the fragments are of bills, lists, trivial letters, and inventories, but altogether they show a form of urban life that was complex, vibrant, cultured, and nourished from one of the twin taproots of our own culture, that of 5th and 4th century Athens. In a word, life at Oxyrhynchus is what we easily recognize as civilization. If we shift our gaze northward, we can see a similar pattern in Syria. Passing over Judea, we can note that Jerusalem, with the establishment of Christianity, had recovered its original name after its centuries of damnatio memoriae, destruction of memory, having been renamed as Aelia Capitolina. It had been adorned by Constantine's mother, Helena, and already in the 300s AD had become a focus of pilgrimage from across the entire Roman Mediterranean. The Basilica of the Holy Sepulchre was being constructed there in 326 AD, when Helena, who was present, is legendarily said to have discovered the true cross in the excavations. We have seen in the last episode the popular and official fervor which greeted Emperor Heraclius when he returned this relic to the city in 630 AD. However, the Temple Mount, the site of the Jewish temple destroyed by Titus in 70 AD, remained empty and deliberately disdained by the authorities and the Christian populace of the Roman city. Moving on to Syria, we see that necklace of spectacularly adorned Greco-Roman cities, the fruit of the Alexandrian conquest, with their palatially colonnaded shopping streets, their sumptuous theatres, and their wide forums. Antiochia was the center and capital, but cities such as Apamea, Damascus, Philippopolis, Palmyra, Petra, and Samosata, and a string of cities along the Levantine coast, show ruins of equal splendor. There was no Syria before the Alexandrian and Roman dominions. The whole region had been a patchwork of Near Eastern city kingdoms, each with its own gods and ethnic identity. There had been Nabateans, Phoenicians, Arameans, etc. It became an even more cosmopolitan society than Egypt. For Egypt retained, in the memory of its villagers and its priests, the image of Keme, the native word for pre-Greek Egypt. There was no such memory preserved in the cities of the Levant, except, of course, Jerusalem. The Roman provincial cities of Syria produced a string of the first rank of Hellenic writers and thinkers, many of them natives, not Greeks, such as Lucian of Samosata and the Neoplatonist philosophers Porphyry of Tyre and Iamblichus. Ammianus Marcellinus, the historian, wrote in Latin and was a Greek from Antioch. The ample ruins of these Greco-Roman cities of Syria are, even today, spectacular reminders of the society and way of life that once had been. This then was the milieu in which Christianity was first incubated and in which it grew most luxuriantly. Saint Paul, a Roman citizen and Greek-speaking Jew from Tarsus in Cilicia, just north of Syria, was on his way from Jerusalem to Damascus in Syria when he underwent his conversion experience. The early Christianoi were little communities in the Greek cities of Antioch, of coastal Asia Minor, and of Alexandria. Many, if not most, of the chief characteristics of Christianity had their origin in Syria and Egypt. This was the melting pot, the smithy of spiritual creativity and of ecclesiastical development. The veneration of sacred remains of the apostles firstly, then of the martyrs of the great persecutions, and then of a swelling crowd of saints, was central to Christian spirituality and ritual practice from a very early date. Remains, that is, the corpses of saints and martyrs, were felt to possess something of the divine power, the dunamis, the root of our word dynamic, the energy from the superlunary world, whose benefits were believed to be accessible to devotees. There is only a very thin precedent for such beliefs within Judaism, the parent of Christianity. The successful spread of Judaic messianic ideas through the Eastern Mediterranean entailed a natural process of their transformation by the society that embraced them. In 391 AD, Emperor Theodosius tried to bring the head of Ioannis the Baptist to Constantinople. His predecessor Valens had failed to do so because the mules carrying it had refused to go further than Chalcedon, where the relic had since remained. Theodosius went to Chalcedon, where the relic was in the keeping of an Arian community. The woman who was in charge refused to release the relic to him, he, the emperor. But he threw his purple imperial cloak over it and took it under his arm. Nobody stopped him. He had a great church erected at Hebdomon to house it, just outside Constantinople, and he prayed there regularly, and not long afterwards, a miracle by the saint was attested. The purpose of this tug-of-war over the relic was to bestow on the new city of Constantinople the nimbus of spiritual prestige and status which it still lacked. The power of relics remained central to Christian belief and practice for over 1,000 years, until it was systematically attacked and ridiculed by the Reformation. Hierarchy was a Roman speciality, but Egypt provided a model which the bishops of Rome came to imitate. Bishops were the lords of the Christian cities, and each was autonomous, save for the imperial decrees issued after a church council. By 320 AD, Egypt, including Libya, had between 90 and 100 city bishoprics. But the Bishop of Alexandria was recognized as the unquestioned head and authority over all the others. The bishops of Alexandria must have felt the power of their preeminent position. They were soon inveighing against opponents in theological disputes of epic proportions. Bishop Athanasius shot his theological thunderbolts from Alexandria out beyond the great lighthouse of the Pharos against his enemies in Antioch, Nicomedia, and Constantinople. His polemic established the basic tenets of Orthodox Christianity, as opposed to its many varieties of challengers, who were damned by the Orthodox, orthos doxa, right opinion, as heretics, airesis, the choosing of a philosophical sect. At issue was always the conundrum of the Trinity, how a polytheistic tripartite God could also be the one God of monotheism, and if so, how precisely. The religious punctiliousness was Judaic, but the focus on abstract concepts and the hair-splitting argumentation were transposed whole from the disputes between the Platonic, Stoic, and other Hellenic philosophical sects. Europe owes, I think, the peculiar character of its intellectual outlook on the world, its terminological precision, its speculative enthusiasm, its argumentativeness and delight in argument for its own sake, to these Romano-Hellenic, Greek-speaking, philosophically educated church fathers of the 300s and 600s AD. The term patriarch is not used in Christianity until the 500s. Egypt itself was massively Christian. In 313 AD, Christians were about 20% of the population. By Constantine's death in 337, the number had doubled to 40%. By the early 400s, this had risen to 80%. There was a degree of conscious spiritual competitiveness between the holy men of Syria and those of Egypt. In Syria, the story is one of a search for a gnosis, an exclusive and elite inner knowledge and connection to the divine. This impulse becomes marked after the Roman state took the side of the Christians and established the bishops as autonomous high officials of the empire. The original benefit felt by the early Christian coteries had been knowing that they were one of the few, the chosen, who were going to be literally saved from the coming catastrophe. Exclusivity, a privileged spiritual position, and insight remained a key theme in the Romanized Christianity of the empire. In Syria, we begin to see, even in the late 200s and early 300s, individuals who were prepared to go to astonishing lengths, as Jonathan Swift put it, to be quit of number. We see the figure of the hermit, Eremites, from Eremia, the desert. There were Syrian pagan models for this. The Nazirs, or public celibates and non-drinkers of wine, and the philosophic therapeutae of the western Nile Delta. The most famous of the Syrians is perhaps Simeon Stylites, who took up his stand as a spiritual athlete extraordinaire on a small platform perched on top of a classical column in the wilderness near Aleppo. He stayed there for 37 years, apparently. Another example is Saint Mary of Egypt, Maria Aegyptiaca, whose hagiography was written by Sophronius, Patriarch of Jerusalem, who figures tragically in our story a little later. In the fulsome manner of saints' lives, Sophronius tells us that Maria had been born of a comfortable family in Alexandria, but on being orphaned at the age of 12, she had thrown herself into the life of a prostitute on the margins of the theatre and the circus arena. Hearing at the quayside of Alexandria some men who said they were going to Jerusalem, she paid her passage in kind and duly arrived outside the previously mentioned Basilica of the Holy Sepulchre. Some force held her back from entering, and a voice informed her that if she went beyond the river Jordan, that is, into the desert, there she would find inner peace. She did so, taking with her 3 loaves of bread, which she lived off, supplemented by roots and herbs, for the next 17 years. Zosimus was a monk staying at the monastery of St. Ioannis, St. John, on the edge of the desert. One day he saw what he took to be a strange wild beast, and then realized it was a wizened old woman, her skin blackened by the sun. He gave her his coat to cover her nakedness, and asked her blessing. It was then that she told him the story of her life, in exchange for news about the kings and kingdoms of the world she had left. This life of Saint Mary became one of the most popular and widely translated throughout the whole of the European Middle Ages. Anchoritism, Greek anachorein, to withdraw, sprang up in Egypt also. Bishop Athanasius of Alexandria wrote the biography of Antonius the Great, Saint Anthony, from whom all men in the world called Tony derived their Christian name. Born near Heracleopolis in the Middle Nile, reportedly again of a wealthy family, in middle life he threw up his comfortable existence and retreated, as many had done before him, to the desert. In Egypt, the desert begins within walking distance of the fertile valley of the Nile. He occupied a tomb which he remained in for 13 years before falling ill. On recovery, he set off further into the desert to an abandoned Roman outpost, within whose walls he remained for a further 20 years. Local people came and threw food for him over the walls. In later life, he tolerated and then encouraged a community of followers to form nearby and gave them a rule to order their lives. This format reflects the original idea of the monastery. Monos means alone. It was a scattering of hermit cells, usually under the ground and having several rooms laid out like a townhouse, where the monachos lived in solitude, but coming together with his fellows for some prayers and other rituals. Communal eating and the provision of alms and the care for the poor and the sick later became added collective activities. Another spiritual athlete, a retired Roman soldier, Pachomius, deliberately set up a community to live together on fertile land in a deserted village in the Nile Valley itself. The layout of a Pachomian settlement is so similar to a small Roman military facility that archaeologists find it hard to distinguish whether the foundation remains they unearth are military or monastic. And of course, the monastery was to quickly spread across to southern Italy and from there to the furthest and remotest corners of Europe, and become a key institution of stability and continuity during the very violent and destructive centuries that Europe was in the future to experience. All these powerful and long-lasting religious innovations, which have been central characteristics of Christianity, were the product of Romano-Christian Syria and Egypt. Since the late 200s AD, the emperors had thrown off the polite pretense of Augustus and his successors, that he was but the princeps, the first citizen, from which we derive our word prince. From the 4th century, the emperor was dominus, lord. This is the term that has entered the Christian liturgy and remains with us to this day. His Greek title, autokrator, meant the ruling self-ruler. For all the vivid splendor of the Roman imperial style, certain limits to the autokrator's power were imposed by society. The emperor faced constituencies which had to be appeased and to be won over. In the civic sphere, there remained the interests of the Senate and the people. The ancient Roman republican device of senatus populusque, by or through the will of the Senate and the people, remained a political reality, if in greatly attenuated form. In the Constantinople of the 600s AD, the Senate was composed of the great landowners and city leaders of the provinces, together with the leading bureaucrats of the capital. Many of these were also members of the imperial court. Under the reign of Constans II, the Senate exercised considerable political influence and initiative. Now there was the army, whose politically potent core were the excubitores, those not in bed, the personal bodyguard of the emperor. In 602, Emperor Mauricius Maurus tried to reduce the pay of the army and was overthrown by a junior officer, Phocas, acting as a kind of union representative for the Danube soldiers. He in turn was ousted by Heraclius in 608 with the aid of the excubitores. There was the populace, the people. A key characteristic of the imperial power system was the buying off of the plebeian levels of the capital city's population. This was done through generous social welfare in the form of free bread, the annone. In the staging of staggeringly sumptuous games in the arena, where the emperors appeared as the benign benefactors of the people, and in displays of imperial power in the executions that preceded the main entertainment. By the 400s AD, the effects of Christianization had rendered the gladiatorial games disreputable, not so much because the clergy pitied the combatants, but because of the crowd's bloodlust frenzy, which the life and death action in the great arenas stimulated. While the games withered away through clerical disapproval, chariot racing flourished as never before. Constantinople was built with a magnificent hippodrome at its political center, next to the great palace and to Hagia Sophia. It had no arena, no colosseum. The hippodrome was the place where the body politic manifested itself. The munificent emperor, sitting in full pomp, was balanced by the immense mass of the roaring populace. In this setting, the autocrat and his people were on more of an equal footing than in any other situation. Here the circus factions had their moment, the blues and the greens, whose function was to lead the acclamations of the emperor in the arena. The comparison with modern football crowds is often made. The sources always stress the mindless destructiveness of the sporadic riots of the circus factions. The factions were organized in guilds. They had their core superfans, their ultras. At one time these were known as the Unni, the Huns, because of their partly shaved heads and extra long sleeves in the Hunnish fashion. The emperor was supposed to be beneficent towards and impartial between them, giving victory crowns to the best charioteers of either side. But this seeming concord could just as easily turn very sour, when a faction would boo the emperor or demonstrate their displeasure. Justinian I made the mistake of favouring the Greens too obviously, and the stadium erupted in what were known as the Nike riots. His unleashing of the imperial guard led to thousands of deaths. The hippodrome at Constantinople, and in all the large provincial cities, was a political arena and a volatile one. The factions at Constantinople operated a branch system throughout the empire. The cities of Syria and Egypt saw repeated destructive urban riots during the late 500s and early 600s, perpetrated by their circus factions. Their cause was often the pointless rage of fans whose team had lost. Sometimes a high political issue was at stake. For example, the Blues and the Greens took sides in the short civil war between Phocas and Heraclius. The other great organized constituency was the Church, in the form of the episcopate, led by the patriarchs of the main cities. Here the factional spirit of the circus was put in the shade by divisive animosities among the bishops and deacons. The monotheistic, polytheistic conundrum at the heart of Christianity, the Trinity, gave ample room for the meticulously abstract minds of the clergy to find exquisite reasons to abominate one another. The argument over the definition of the Trinity had been going on now for centuries. The Alexandrians emphasized the, quote, one nature of the incarnate Word, end quote. For this theory they were called the Monophysites. The Antiochenes believed that Christ retained two natures after his incarnation. These were called Nestorians after the patriarch Nestorius. Neither agreed with Constantinople or with Rome. In 451, a church council held at Chalcedon, a city across the Bosphorus from Constantinople, published a creed which sought a middle way between these two extremes. It insisted that, quote, the one and the same Christ, Son, Lord, only begotten, be acknowledged in two natures, inconfusedly, unchangeably, invisibly, inseparably, end quote. This can be seen as a formula which set ambiguity in stone, perhaps a contradiction. The Emperor Flavius Marcianus backed the new dogma and made it official imperial ideology and public policy. This was to finally end the divisions and unite the society. Instead, it split the church into three factions: the Chalcedonians, backed by the emperors, the Monophysites, concentrated in Egypt, but numerous also in Syria, and the Nestorians of Antioch, who fled or migrated into the Sassanid Empire, where they continued to live as Christians down the centuries. It is only today, in present-day Iraq, that they are being brought to the verge of extinction under murderous attacks from some among their Muslim neighbours. The rancor over the Trinity continued into the mid-600s. Imperial suppression of religious opposition meant that Chalcedonian bishops took over the churches and the properties of their Monophysite opponents. Their response was to make plots and conspiracies. In 577 AD, it appears that the Monophysite circles in Syria generated reports that pagans of the great sanctuary of Heliopolis, modern Baalbek, were plotting a rising against the Christians and a massacre of them. This was believed and taken extremely seriously at Constantinople. People at the time feared a resurgence of sections of society that they knew were covertly still pagan. The high official Theophilus was sent with full powers to Heliopolis to uncover the conspirators. Suspected pagans were arrested and tortured. Confessions were obtained confirming the conspiracy, and a list extracted of the names of prominent people of all the cities of Syria, especially of Antioch, and those of the surrounding provinces. Some of the highest dignitaries in Syria and at Edessa in Osroene were arrested, including the deputy praetorian prefect Anatolius and the bishop Gregorius. The outcome of trials in Antioch, and for the greatest personages in Constantinople, was that many prominent citizens were crucified or otherwise executed. The persecution shows a number of striking features of the ancient world, nearly 3 centuries after the triumph of Christianity. That it was believed, no doubt with reason, that major figures and their supporters still wanted a return to the Olympian gods. That laws existed and were invoked to set up an inquiry into serious religious dissidents, an inquisitio, and that Christian society was still crucifying condemned criminals in the public spaces, while worshipping the crucified one as God in their churches. All the features of religious repression notoriously associated with Habsburg Spain in the 1500s were in place and accorded with the sentiments of society 1,000 years earlier, already in the 500s AD. All this world, this social reality we call late antiquity, was to be swept away, or nearly so, in the first half of the 600s AD. As this is arguably the most sudden and consequential civilizational reversal ever to have occurred in recorded history, it is worth taking some time to examine how what normally would not have happened, happened. The Roman Empire was indeed not at the very height of its power and resources, as it had been 400 years previously. But it was very much on its feet and remained, socially and politically, a vast going concern. No one at that time, celebrating Christmas of the year 600 AD, had any idea that their state, their society, its culture, its values, and its very way of life were doomed within a generation to be cast down and subjugated to an utterly alien power, and slowly thereafter to be extinguished even from human memory. For the civilization of the Greco-Roman Eastern and Southern Mediterranean is the true and real lost civilization of human history. It is not necessary to cut one's way through dense jungles or ford impassable rivers to find this lost world. It is a short plane journey away, but buried and obliterated underneath another civilization. The obliteration, from the French oubli, forgetting, has been comprehensive. Popular culture knows about Cleopatra's Egypt and it's somehow being mixed up with the Romans. But our culture is a blank concerning the 600 years between her reign and the Islamic invasions. I think it is accurate to say that the vast majority of people in North Africa, Egypt, and Syria have an even more vague idea of what existed before Islam. The ruins scattered over the whole region are like the protruding bones of a huge dinosaur, a mystery to those who live nearby, and of incomprehending wonder to the Western tourists who come to see them. So what happened? In the short period between 611 and 636 AD, just 25 years, 2 enormous blows were dealt to the Roman Empire, one after another. The Sassanid invasion of 611 and harsh occupation of Syria and Egypt, together with the devastation of Asia Minor, shocked many Romans into a fervent sense of political and religious unity. The stunning victory of Emperor Heraclius in 627 ushered in what seemed to be an era of great renewal and optimism, a true restauratio imperii, restoration of the empire. Beginning in 629, Heraclius began to style himself not merely as Augustus, but as Vasileos, Greek for sovereign king. Ambassadors from the Avars came to Constantinople to acknowledge Roman power and to become Christians. The emperor undertook a major reconstruction program, with what money he could find, of the churches and monasteries that the Persians had destroyed. There was a concerted policy of bringing about the conversion of Persia, which became realistic when the great Sassanid general Shahrbaraz became a Christian. As mentioned, the great fervour with which Heraclius returned the true cross to Jerusalem was the high point in this almost millennial feeling among the imperial establishment and the Chalcedonian clergy. In keeping with this, an edict was issued ordering all Jews in the empire to convert or face persecution. This was enforced, in fact, only at Carthage. In Cyrenaica, that is Libya, and in Syria, the Roman forces were in some disarray as they waited for the Sassanid garrisons to withdraw eastwards. However, history occasionally operates by means of enormous accidents. 1,000 kilometers to the south, halfway down the western Arabian Peninsula, certain events were occurring which were to change the world permanently to this day. Very little was known about this region. The Greek and Roman geographers, such as Strabo, called the southern tip of the peninsula Arabia Felix, Fortunate Arabia. This name reflects the contrast felt with the generally empty, desolate, and forbidding image that the rest of the peninsula held in the eyes of the civilized north. And here we encounter the first of the contested issues that cling so much to the history of Islam. Contrary to the pious assertions of the Muslim chronicles' exclusive focus on the preeminence of Mecca, in the contemporary non-Muslim sources from this period, there is no awareness at all that this settlement existed. In the 1950s, William Montgomery Watt proposed that the reason for the appearance and success of Muhammad was to be found in the dynamic and central economic role of Mecca. The main clans there grew rich on the trade in spices, silks, gems, etc., which they traded from Yemen to Syria, he said. Their great wealth led to social tensions and an undermining of the old customs of solidarity. Muhammad's message was a response to this crisis, caused by crass materialism and mounting injustice. This thesis is to be found repeated verbatim in many books and articles, imparted as a great insight. Instead, scholars such as Patricia Crone and others have exposed this as hardly more than theory spinning. Mecca was above all a sanctuary of the original polytheistic and eclectic beliefs of the tribes of Western Arabia, on account of the unusual black stone, possibly a meteorite, venerated there as the god Hubal. Very little is reliably known about the mid-7th century Arabia. So scarce are the trustworthy sources. The Islamic tradition concerning this foundational moment, swallowed whole or in part by Western scholars who should know better, is based on pious and programmatically religio-political reconstructions after the events. As has been devastatingly pointed out by Patricia Crone, Western scholars for over a century have attempted to subject the Islamic canon of authoritative documents to what is called Quellenkritik, the scientific form critique of sources which had been so successfully applied to the Jewish Pentateuch. What the exhaustive Quellenkritik concluded was that the so-called sources of the Islamic tradition are comprehensively secondary and far distant ones. Whether one approaches Islamic historiography from the angle of the religious or the tribal tradition, its overall character remains the same. The bulk of it is debris of an obliterated past. The pattern in which the debris began to be arranged in the 8th century AD acquired the status of historiographical Sunnah in the 9th, the century in which the classical works of history and the Hadith were compiled. So, what can be said about these events, which have had such momentous consequences for Europe? We can, cautiously, try to suggest some likely forms that the movement may have taken in accordance with what is plausible, informed by our sociological understanding of the way such societies behave. We know that the tribes of Western Arabia lived in a hard and exacting environment. Everything depended on widely dispersed water sources on pasturage for their livestock. A nomadic lifestyle of movement with the seasons was a necessity. They were a tent-dwelling people, with some settled communities living in watered places, in simple flat-roofed houses. The Bedou tribes were fiercely independent and fiercely warlike towards one another. A combination of elaborate hospitality given to bona fide strangers was matched by a ruthless aggressiveness towards others. Intertribal warfare, devastating dawn raids, the killing of everyone in sight, and the taking of one's enemies as slaves, all these were part of the code of tribal and manly honor. Here is part of a lament by the sister of someone called Amr, of the Banu Hudayl tribe, who had been eaten by 2 leopards who had surprised him in his sleep. It dates from the 500s AD. I swear, O Amr, had they aroused you, they would have aroused a formidable thing. They would have indeed have aroused a man who was not timorous, nor apprehensive, nor irresolute when attacked. Many is the group of horses whose riders you have seen in the distance, and who turned their backs, deeming confrontation with you no little matter. Many the tribe you have despoiled, many the tribe you have attacked in the morning, many the tribe you have delivered to a swift doom. Many are the wars you have taken part in, many are the gaps you have blocked to the enemy, many are the strong warriors on whom you have tied the ropes of captivity. Much is the wealth you have acquired, many are the horses you protected, many the guest for whom you provided food, when he was afraid of the consequences of slow travel." End quote. It is all there, the life of the desert, the harshness of the climate, quote, when the horizon was choked with dust and the wind blew from the north, and when suckling women abandoned their children, and when no eye saw moisture in the cloud. End quote. Also the position of women in a nomadic society, quote, as soon as they became aware of Amir's presence, they would abandon to him their women and their tents. End quote. The hunger for plunder, quote, the Fam, a tribe, knew full well that in an encounter they would have become booty, nafal, to you, O Amr. End quote. This was the ethic of the Arabian deserts, a hard, fierce, and unforgiving place. From the perspective of the colonnaded streets of Apamea or Alexandria, this was definitely a desolate, far-off region inhabited by a barbarous people. But something unique did happen among these particular barbarians, probably unique in human history. During the early 600s, another of their prophets arose, part poet, part religious seer, Muhammad. It seems he was possessed of a single central idea, of a monotheism so absolute, so radical, that it left room for nothing else, the idea of the oneness of God. Not even the ancient Jews, the specialists in monotheism, had conceived a oneness so radical, so empty of recognizable content, as vast and featureless as the rolling emptiness of the Arabian desert. Patricia Crone remarks that Islam is the only world religion that began in the mind of a single man. All others, Christianity, Buddhism, Hinduism, etc., were the collective product of coteries of disciples and later followers. and indeed it is likely that Islam was also, but that this background has become irrevocably lost to us. An inexorable logic spins out from such a fierce insistence on an undifferentiated, unhumanized oneness. If the God had no progenitor and no offspring, no sharer in his godhood, then he is powerful without limit, without a wrinkle in the flat surface of his essence stretching to infinity. His demands upon mankind are that they should first know of him and then utterly submit themselves to him. To communicate this knowing of him, he requires a human mouthpiece, a messenger. Since the messenger lays down what God is and what he requires, the messenger is by right to obtain the submission of mankind to what is only the stated will of God. This is why the key statement of Islam is the Shahada, which runs, "There is no God but God, and Muhammad is the messenger of God." It's remarkably simple, like an equation, a collapsed theology. In the context of the early 7th century Western Arabia, the mankind addressed by God were the Arabs. The political achievement of Muhammad, we can infer, was for the first time to unite the tribes into a super tribe, the believers, the Ummah. To do this, Muhammad must have offered highly convincing proofs of Allah's power and of the benefits of submission to him. He would have had to make a clean break with the paradigm of tribal solidarity and its value system. It is said that he openly rejected the tribal gods and the genealogy of his own people, the Quraysh, which is very plausible. The tradition says that he led his followers from Medina in raids against the caravans of his own tribe. In the conditions of meager diet and chronic famine under which the Bedou lived, raiding or razzia as an activity brought windfall riches to all who participated, each according to his share. By whatever means, Muhammad succeeded at Medina in developing a self-reinforcing mechanism which drew ever more tribesmen away from their time-honored allegiances and into his own body of followers. This was the key to his success, the tipping point. By 630, it is believed that he had overawed and subjugated his enemies at Mecca, had taken control of the sanctuary there, and had at his disposal both a swelling force of thousands of warriors and a charismatic ideology of oneness and obedience with which to guide the tribal leaders who made up his circle. If this was the case, then Islam is also unique among world religions in being the only one which was, from its inception, energized by a symbiosis between a religious vision and armed aggression. That ferment of religious military energy built up to the point of exploding in the 2 short years between Muhammad's triumph and his death in 632. Consistent with the principle of the oneness of God and the unity of God's people, the Ummah, the whole of the Arabian Peninsula, including those tribes in what we today call the Gulf states, were subjugated in a series of rapid military campaigns by Muhammad's companion and successor Abu Bakr, acting with the title of Khalifa, the successor of the Prophet representing God. It seems to me that what we are seeing here is a dynamic snowballing effect. The inner core, the companions of the Prophet as they were later called, would have been under the direct charismatic influence of Muhammad and would have been fully imbued with his revolutionary millennial vision. The rank and file of the tribesmen could not have been so well tutored. But in complete consistency with their tribal warrior ethic, they would have been swept up in the dynamo of success bringing further success on an ever grander scale, far beyond their widest mental horizons as tribesmen. A dynamic, authoritative, and audacious leadership directed their swarming aggressions outwards. A charismatic social and military movement, we know, requires the effect of rolling victories, each one greater than the last. The victories affirm, prove the truth of the belief animating the excited movement. A major defeat at an early stage could, consequently, have burst the bubble and seen the dispersion back to their separate tribal lands of the assembled warriors. But by good leadership and a remarkable run of good luck, no such setback appears to have occurred. This leadership, thanks no doubt to the mind-stretching lessons of the prophet, had horizons that for the first time looked far beyond the closed world of the Arabian Peninsula. To the north lived Arab tribes who had for several centuries undergone processes of being clients and being assimilated to the civilized world, just as the Germanic tribal elites who became clients of the Romans along the Danube and Rhine had done. These were the Ghassanids and the Lakhmids. They lived in small cities surrounded by walls. They had, or their upper layers had, typical of foederati, converted to Christianity during the previous century. The Ghassanids in the west to Monophysitism, and the Lakhmids in the east, clients of the Sassanids, to Nestorianism. In 578, the chieftain of the Ghassanid tribe, Al-Mundarus, a Monophysite, was greeted with honor in Constantinople by Emperor Flavius Tiberius II Constantinus. Al-Mundarus undertook to recommit his people to the defense of the empire against the Sassanids and their Arab allies, the Lakhmids. In return, Emperor Tiberius undertook to grant toleration to the Monophysites, a fact that Al-Mundarus was allowed to announce in public in Antiochia on his way home. By 633, this cozy relationship was coming to an end. Money was tight in the aftermath of the huge effort required to win the Sassanid War. Heracles had cut the pay of the soldiers by half during the war, and they were now paid in copper coins rather than silver. It is reported that when the Ghassanid tribesmen came to Caesarea in Palestine to claim their subsidy, that the imperial eunuch said to them, quote, "If the master finds it difficult to pay his own soldiers, what has he left to give to the dogs?" End quote. This may not have gone down too well with the Arabs. One of the northern Bedouin tribes, the Harith, launched a razzia raid into Lakhmid territory on the Tigris, plundering several towns. There was nothing unusual about this, except that this time they found little resistance. And here it would have remained yet another localized predatory raid from the desert, had the Harith not been brought into the network of the peninsula Umma out to the south. A new consciousness of unfolding possibilities must have been in play. They sent word to Abu Bakr in Medina concerning the vulnerability in the north and the rich booty that could be had for the taking. A large expeditionary force was assembled at Al-Yamamah, an arid settlement just on the cusp of the great plateau that looks out northwards over the desert. The tribes under the experienced Khalid ben al-Walid, styling himself the drawn sword of God, set out across the desert. This was a strong force of infantry mounted on camels, animals who were undaunted by such a journey. They soon took the chief city of the Lakhmids, Al-Hira. The inhabitants were forced to pay tribute, which was divided among the believers. And so Khalid continued for 3 months, taking one Sassanid city after another, all the way along the Tigris. The tribesmen from central Arabia had never seen anything like these places in their lives. They were in a wonderland, a happy hunting ground of abundant water and endless targets for plunder. The prophet had spoken the truth. And so the process began, which was to change the world in rolling waves of conquest, which was not to be stopped until the late 17th century.